Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Kinane. Coming up, division in the opposition over the cost of asylum seekers attending today's funerals. The new viral weapons in the home loan war between the big banks. And has Julia Gillard's hospital deal neglected the mentally ill? Our panel tonight, former Liberal MP Bruce Baird, Peter Lewis from Essential Media, and in Canberra, the ABC social media reporter Latika Burke. Well, there were emotional scenes in Sydney today as 8 victims of the Christmas Island boat tragedy were laid to rest. As the funerals got underway, a political row was unfolding over whether taxpayers should pay the costs for relatives who survived the tragedy to fly to the mainland. Shadow Immigration Minister Scott Morrison has attacked the government over the agreement, claiming it was unreasonably generous.
I think the public want to see the government show some sense when it comes to the spending of taxpayers' money. Now, any other Australian who wanted to attend a funeral for someone who died in tragic circumstances would have to put their hand in their own pocket. It's just a question of what is a reasonable request in these circumstances. I think the government has gone a bit too far with this, particularly given there are so many instances of this government spending money hand over fist, and particularly in this area.
But Shadow Treasurer Joe Hockey broke ranks with his front bench colleague, saying Australia had an obligation to help the grieving families.
No matter what the colour of your skin, no matter what the nature of your faith, if your child has died or a father has died, you want to be there for the ceremony to say goodbye, and I totally understand the importance of this to those families. I think we as a compassionate nation have an obligation to ensure that we retain our humanity during what is a very difficult policy debate.
Bruce, you know Scott Morrison well. He succeeded you in the seat of Cook when you retired from federal politics. What do you make of his comments?
Look, I'm very disappointed that Scott would make these comments. It is lacking in compassion at the very time when these people have been through such a traumatic event. You know, losing family members, the least you could do is to assist them to go to the funeral. If we can't do that, there's something wrong with the Australian character, and I don't believe that's the case. At the core, Australians are generous and sympathetic and sensitive. And I think most people would support the fact that if someone dies in such tragic circumstances, we would assist them to go to the funeral.
Peter, the argument Scott Morrison seems to be putting is that they could have had the funerals in Christmas Island and the family members could have flown over there and paid their own expenses.
Look, I think Bruce is being kind to Scott Morrison. I think it was an absolutely grubby act and an abject failure of leadership. You can talk about the specifics of whether or not the airfare should have been paid, but what Morrison is really doing with this salvo is reinforcing that these poor souls are wrongdoers, and it's the whole basis of where this asylum seeker debate has got out of control. I've done a fair bit of public research on this. Most people's attitudes towards asylum seekers are based on 3 untruths. Firstly, that it's illegal to seek asylum. Secondly, that most people that seek asylum are rorting the system. 90% are found to be legitimate political refugees. And thirdly, that we're being overrun. You know, last year fewer than 1% of our immigration intake were asylum seekers arriving by boat. So, you know, this is, if you're going to have a debate about asylum seekers, you've got to start with some pretty basic principles that, you know, these people have not broken the rules. They're caught up in a system, but they're exercising a legal right to seek asylum.
Peter, another argument that resonates with people, though, is that they're jumping a queue, that they're stopping other asylum seekers who may be waiting in camps for long periods of time from coming to Australia. Is that a legitimate argument?
You talk to the UNHCR and they'll tell you that in a lot of these places there is no queue. Now, look, it's fine to have a debate about border protection. You know, it is fine. You don't want to be supporting people smugglers, but you've got to start with the basics, that these people aren't breaking the rules, they haven't done anything wrong, and they shouldn't be punished. And that flows into these sort of lines that this grub Morrison is trying to get out into the public debate today. And good on Joe Hockey for slapping him down.
Latika Burke, what's been the response in Canberra today to Scott Morrison's comments?
Yeah, well, as you've been pointing out, a very different response from Joe Hockey, Scott Morrison's own colleague, and a very marked one and a very deliberate one. I think that there, Steve, are days where politics are just not welcome, and today is one of those days. What we're seeing today is very different from the policy debate we have about what brings asylum seekers to Australia, whether the policies in place are soft or not. Now, it's perfectly legitimate to have those debates, but I think today is a day when we should forget politics and actually remember that we're all humans. And recently we celebrated, indeed on this program, politicians have celebrated the wonderful, compassionate spirit Australians have shown to victims of the Queensland floods. Now, victims of a terrible boat crash are no different victims.
Bruce, Scott Morrison previously has avoided politics on this issue. Back in December when this horrible tragedy unfolded, he said the lives of the men, women and children on these boats are as precious as our own and we mourn their loss. Now, there seems to be a shift in his tone from his comments back in December to now.
Yeah, but he's got to watch that he's not, trying to turn the Liberal Party into an Australian version of the Tea Party. I mean, these type of comments are very inflammatory, undeserved. I mean, they are. I mean, a country is judged by how well you treat the most vulnerable members. And here are people who are escaping from often very difficult circumstances in the homeland. They have this horrendous boat sinking, and a lot of them lose their lives. And then we're going to say, we begrudge you supporting it, take to the funeral. I just think, you can't be a man for all seasons. You can't say on one side, look, I don't want to get into this, people's lives have been lost, and then just come out and say, I think the government's spending too much money. I think we want to see greater consistency, more compassion. I mean, the government itself is not handling these issues as well as they could, there's no question. Well, but at least they paid for the funeral costs.
Well, let's get to that issue, Peter Lewis, the issue of compassion from the government, because refugee advocates have been very critical of Chris Bowen for not allowing those victims or those survivors of that boat crash to be released from detention, and there's a number of significant examples of that. There's a man who's lost his son, his daughter, his wife, his whole family has been wiped out in this tragedy. He's now in Sydney for one of the funerals. He's got a brother living in Sydney. He's begging to be released. There's a similar story of a 9-year-old boy who's been orphaned in this tragedy, and once again he's in detention at Christmas Island. He's got family members in Sydney, and Chris Bowen has said that he wants to get back in October. He said he wanted to get children out of detention. But this child is in detention on Christmas Island. There's a little window where he could have stayed in Sydney, but it seems like he's going to fly back.
Yeah, look, the difference I would make is that Bowen is managing a difficult issue and there are going to be some tough calls involved. He's not trying to inflame it, which was what Scott Morrison was doing today, and I think that's the big difference. There is no votes to be gained in Australia in being seen to be compassionate or soft on asylum seekers. I actually thought Labor, the big story last year was Labor actually made a call and then there was no one from the left backing them in when they talked about getting kids out of detention. It's a really tough policy issue, and I go back to the fact that, the leadership here is actually about getting the baseline facts out there in the public domain so we can have a sensible debate and not a...
But nevertheless, I mean, I was part of a group 4 years ago that brought in a private members bill that prevented children being put in detention, and we've got them, even though technically they're just outside the fences and living separately. But, for heaven's sake, there's no reason why these people can't be living in the community. You tell them this is, we will process your claim. If you abscond, it's the last chance you ever have got for staying in Australia. If you arrive by air, that's what happens. If you arrive by boat, for some reason they're a whole different class of people. And in fact, the approval rating of people who come by boat is much higher. And accepted as genuine refugees. So I'm not quite sure why this whole dichotomy.
Latika, a quick comment from you. Do you think Chris Bowen may be under pressure now that these people have come to Sydney and we've seen their faces, we've seen their grief, that maybe he may be under some pressure to release some of them into the community in Sydney and in other parts of the country where they do have family members?
Well, the problem for the government is they do have to be consistent and stick to a processing approach that they've committed to. Otherwise, you get into these situations where, well, if this person is exempt, why not this person? I think Chris Bowen is actually doing a a good job, actually. If you watch what he is doing, he's very carefully, but quietly, but confidently setting out the facts. He is countering the opposition's arguments where he can. And Chris Evans, the former Immigration Minister, said off the record, which was then put on the record, but he didn't realise the journalist was there, said that his greatest failure was losing control of the immigration debate, was saying nothing. Now, Chris Bowen, since he took over the portfolio, has done a lot more than that. He has tried to go out there and set out some facts. The problem he has is he's dealing with that decision that the Rudd government made to put basically a halt on processing for 6 months, and that has created the enormous pressure in the immigration system that Chris Bowen's dealing with now.
OK, moving on to other issues, and it's been an interesting week for Tony Abbott. He's faced frontbench rumblings over how to pay for the floods, had problems with his deputy and a run-in with a reporter. And this week's Essential Report on the Drum website is all about how voters see the opposition leader, and the polling has found his disapproval rating went up by 9 points in the last month. Now, Peter, you wrote this piece for the Drum today. You're arguing that Tony Abbott's disapproval level is getting to dangerous levels. Why do you say that?
Look, my starting point is most politicians' strengths are their weaknesses. Abbott has always been a very, very effective negative campaigner. Look back at the Republic. He convinced Australians to vote against a Republic because they didn't like politicians. He was very effective on climate change. But when he over-eggs it and picks the wrong target, there seems to be a recoil amongst voters, particularly amongst female voters. This is the third surge in disapproval we've picked up over the last 12 months. The first was when he ran negative on the federal health reform package last year in that infamous press club debate with Kevin Rudd, where he was running negative and Rudd was the father of the nation, probably his last great moment as Prime Minister. Then it surged again after the federal election when there was a sense that he was going to blow up the House because he hadn't managed to get the deal. And now we've picked it up again, and I think it's linked to the flood levy. Now, there wasn't universal love for the idea of a flood levy, but the idea of someone attacking the flood levy seems to have created the recoil this time around. So I've got, you look at the numbers, he's basically where Kevin Rudd was where they rolled him now.
OK, but do approval and disapproval ratings really matter? If you look at the last election, Julia Gillard was preferred Prime Minister by miles, yet, she didn't get over the line by that far. And if you look at the primary vote and the two-party preferred in the Nielsen poll this week and also the News poll last week, Coalition was comfortably ahead of Labor.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that News poll. We've got it at 50-50 at the moment, and obviously the polls jump around and there's margin of error. But what I would say is there's lots of little pieces to the jigsaw, but every team needs a strong leader. And while, a party ID can go better than the leader, it generally is the other way around.
Latika, do you think there are worrying signs for Tony Abbott?
I think where Tony Abbott can perhaps counter this negative perception of him is to produce policy, and his own colleagues have put him on notice about that. And he has said that this year he will produce some really substantial policy. There's quite a few restless backbenchers, most of them